Murders of the Clutter Family. Holcomb, Kansas. On the morning of November 15th, 1959, a small farming community in western Kansas woke to a silence that felt wrong. Holcomb was the kind of town where routines were invisible because they never changed. Cars parked in the same places, lights turned off at the same hours, doors were often left unlocked. When a neighbor noticed that the Clutter family had not begun their day as usual, concern did not arrive all at once. It came slowly. The Clutter home stood just outside town, surrounded by open land and fields that stretched into the distance. Herb Clutter was known throughout the area, successful, disciplined, deeply involved in the community. By mid-morning, concern became action. When people entered the house, they discovered that the entire Clutter family had been killed during the night. Herbert Clutter, his wife Bonnie, and their two children, Nancy and Kenyon. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing appeared stolen. The house was quiet. For Holcomb, the discovery marked the end of a belief that violence was something that happened elsewhere. Herb Clutter was 48 years old. He was a respected farmer, known for modern agricultural methods and strict personal habits. He did not drink. He did not gamble. He paid his workers well. His wife Bonnie struggled with periods of depression and spent much of her time at home. Their daughter Nancy was 16. She was active in school, well-liked, and involved in local activities. Their son Kenyon was 15. He enjoyed mechanics and working with his hands. On the evening of November 14th, 1959, the Clutter family followed their normal routine. There were no reported arguments, no visitors, no disturbances. They went to bed believing they were safe. Sometime during the night, that safety ended. When law enforcement arrived, they found a scene that did not make immediate sense. The victims had been restrained. They had been killed at close range. But the house itself was not ransacked. Drawers were mostly untouched. Valuables remained. Investigators searched for a motive and found none that fit. Herb Clutter was not known to have enemies. The family had no history of threats. The brutality of the crime stood in contrast to the lack of apparent reason. News traveled quickly. Reporters arrived from nearby towns, then from across the state. For residents of Holcomb, the presence of outside attention only deepened the unease. People locked their doors for the first time. Parents checked on children more often. Neighbors watched one another closely. Rumors spread, as they do when facts are scarce. Some believed the killer must have known the family. Others feared a stranger passing through. Kansas Bureau of Investigation agents joined local law enforcement. They worked through the night, documenting every detail. Footprints, tire marks, anything that might suggest how the killers arrived and left. There were no clear leads. The lack of evidence made the case feel unanchored. Then, hundreds of miles away, two men were already moving on. They had not known the Clutter family personally. They had not lived in Holcomb. Their connection to the house came from a rumor. One of them believed that Herb Clutter kept large sums of cash in a safe. That belief was wrong, but it was enough to bring them to the house that night. Their names were Perry Smith and Richard Hickok. At the time of the murders, they were traveling together, moving from place to place, surviving through small crimes and borrowed money. Hickok had heard about the Clutter family from a former cellmate who had once worked on the farm. The story was simple and unverified. A wealthy farmer, a safe full of cash, an isolated house. The idea stayed with Hickok. He spoke about it repeatedly. Eventually, it became a plan. On the night of November 14th, they drove to Holcomb. They parked away from the house and approached quietly. There was no forced entry. Herb Clutter allowed them inside. Followed would later be reconstructed through confession and testimony. The killers searched for the safe. There was no safe. There was very little money. At that point, the crime no longer served its original purpose, but it did not stop. By the time Perry Smith and Richard Hickok left the house, 4 people were dead. They took little with them: a small radio, a pair of binoculars, loose change. The emptiness of the theft stood in stark contrast to the permanence of what they had done. In Holcomb, investigators worked without knowing who they were looking for. There were no fingerprints on record that matched, no witnesses who had seen unfamiliar faces clearly. Leads were followed and discarded. Weeks passed. Fear remained. Meanwhile, Perry Smith and Richard Hickok continued traveling, unaware of how closely the investigation would soon narrow. What ultimately broke the case was not physical evidence. It was a conversation. A former inmate of Hickok's, hearing details of the crime, contacted authorities. The story matched too closely to ignore. Names were given. Descriptions followed. Investigators moved quickly. By the end of December 1959, Perry Smith and Richard Hickok were arrested in Las Vegas. They were brought back to Kansas. The questioning began slowly. Hickok spoke first. Smith followed. Over time, both confessed. Their accounts matched details known only to investigators. The case that had terrified a town was no longer unsolved. But understanding what happened did not make it easier to accept. For Holcomb, the arrests brought relief without comfort. The randomness of the crime lingered. The knowledge that the Clutter family had been killed for a rumor, for nothing, was harder to process than the idea of a personal motive. As the legal process moved forward, the case drew national attention, not only because of the crime itself, but because of what it represented. The intrusion of violence into a place that believed itself immune. This was not a crime of passion, not a dispute, not a revenge. It was a collision between rumor, opportunity, and decision. And its consequences were irreversible. After the arrests, investigators began the long process of reconstructing what had happened inside the Clutter home. The confessions given by Richard Hickok and Perry Smith were detailed, but not identical. Each man described the same night from a different internal perspective. Hickok spoke methodically. He focused on logistics, how they arrived, how they entered the house, what they believed they would find. Smith spoke more emotionally. He described memories, impulses, and moments of hesitation. Together, their accounts allowed investigators to build a timeline that had previously been impossible. They had arrived late in the evening, after the Clutter family had settled in for the night. The house was quiet. Herb Clutter had not resisted when confronted. There was no struggle at the door. The absence of forced entry had confused investigators early on. Now, it made sense. The killers believed they were there for money. They moved through the house with a specific purpose. They restrained the family as they searched. The belief in a safe had driven everything, but there was no safe. What money they found amounted to very little. At that point, the original plan had failed. According to the confessions, the killings did not result from a sudden explosion of anger. They followed a decision, one that unfolded after the realization that the trip had been for nothing. The victims were not strangers in the abstract. They were people encountered face to face. Herbert Clutter had cooperated. Bonnie Clutter had been ill and largely confined to bed. Nancy Clutter and Kenyon Clutter had been asleep. There was no resistance that could explain what followed. That fact weighed heavily on investigators. The lack of necessity, the absence of escalation. The crime did not spiral out of control. It was concluded deliberately. When Perry Smith later spoke about the night, he described moments where he claimed to feel conflicted. He spoke about his childhood, about physical injuries and trauma, about anger that surfaced without warning. These statements would later become central to discussions about his mental state. Hickok, by contrast, described the crime in practical terms. He focused on what went wrong, the rumor that had misled them, the failure of the plan, the wasted effort. This difference in perspective would later matter in court. As the case moved toward trial, Kansas prosecutors prepared to present the evidence carefully. The physical evidence was limited. The crime scene itself had been preserved, but it did not point clearly to any suspect without the confessions. What gave the case strength was consistency. The details provided by the defendants matched what investigators already knew. Small facts that had never been public. Positions of objects, movements within the house, the sequence of events. These details were used to corroborate their statements. The trial began in 1960. For Holcomb, the courtroom proceedings reopened wounds that had barely begun to heal. The Clutter family had been well known. Testimony about their final night was difficult to hear. The prosecution presented the crime as a robbery that turned into murder. The defense did not deny involvement. Instead, it focused on mental responsibility. Perry Smith's background was examined closely. His childhood had been unstable. He had suffered abuse and neglect. He had sustained injuries that some experts believed could have affected his neurological development. Psychiatric evaluations were introduced. The defense argued that Smith's capacity for judgment had been impaired. Hickok's defense followed a different path. He was portrayed as impulsive and opportunistic, but fully aware of his actions. The jury was asked to consider not just what happened, but how responsibility should be assigned. Throughout the trial, the question of motive remained unsettlingly thin. There was no financial gain worth mentioning. There was no personal vendetta. There was only a rumor, believed without verification. This randomness disturbed observers. It suggested that safety could be breached without warning for reasons that made no sense in hindsight. When the verdict was delivered, both men were found guilty of murder. They were sentenced to death. The decision was not greeted with celebration. It was accepted quietly. For the Clutter family's relatives, the verdict did not bring relief so much as finality. The legal process continued through appeals. Years passed. Smith and Hickok remained on death row. During that time, Perry Smith continued to speak with psychiatrists and writers. He reflected on the crime. He alternated between expressions of remorse and emotional detachment. Richard Hickok remained more consistent. He acknowledged responsibility but did not dwell on the moral implications. For the people of Holcomb, the case gradually shifted from immediate tragedy to collective memory. The house where the murders occurred stood as a reminder. The fields remained. The routines resumed. But the assumption of safety never fully returned. What made the Clutter case endure was not only the violence, but the way it disrupted belief. The belief that good people living quietly were protected by distance and familiarity. The belief that evil arrived with warning signs. This crime offered none. It came from a rumor, acted upon by strangers, and left nothing behind that made sense. By the time the executions were carried out in 1965, The case had already entered American consciousness, not as a mystery, not as an unsolved crime, but as an example of how fragile normal life could be. As the years passed on death row, the Clutter case did not fade from attention in the way many resolved crimes do. It lingered, not because of unanswered questions, but because of the way the crime resisted meaning. Perry Smith and Richard Hickok waited nearly 5 years between sentencing and execution. During that time, their lives became defined by repetition, cells, routine, appeals reviewed and denied. For Perry Smith, the waiting became a period of introspection. He spoke at length about his childhood, about physical pain, about feelings of anger and inadequacy that had followed him since adolescence. Psychiatrists continued to examine him. Some believed he suffered from neurological damage. Others believed he understood his actions clearly and acted with intent. Bonnie Clutter was remembered as a quiet presence, often misunderstood because of her illness. Nancy and Kenyon were remembered most vividly. Their youth made the loss feel sharper. In Holcomb, time moved forward, but not cleanly. New families arrived. Children grew up hearing the story secondhand. The house where the murders occurred eventually changed ownership. But for many residents, the memory of that November morning remained vivid. It was a dividing line. Life before, life after. In 1965, after all appeals were exhausted, Perry Smith and Richard Hickok were executed by hanging. The executions were carried out shortly after midnight. There were no speeches, no public ceremony. The state treated it as a conclusion of process, not a moment of spectacle. News of the executions reached Holcomb quietly. For some, it brought a sense of finality. For others, it brought very little at all. The Clutter family was not restored. The randomness of the crime was not explained. What remained was the record. In the years that followed, the case became widely known through a book that examined the crime in detail, blending reporting with narrative. That book brought national attention back to Holcomb and the Clutter family. It also shaped how many people understood the crime. For some, it humanized the perpetrators. For others, it risked overshadowing the victims. The debate about how true crime should be told began there, long before the term became common. At its center remained a question that had no satisfying answer. Why this family? Why this house? Why that night? There was no deeper motive uncovered, no hidden feud, no secret life. The crime did not resolve into meaning, and that, perhaps, is why it endured. The Clutter murders demonstrated that violence does not always grow out of passion, revenge, or desperation. Sometimes it grows out of assumption, out of rumor accepted as fact, out of a plan built on something that was never true. Herb Clutter did not keep a safe. There was no hidden money. That single false belief carried 2 men across Kansas and into a house where 4 people were living ordinary lives. The consequences of that belief were permanent. Late at night, when stories like this are told slowly, without urgency, the details take on a different weight. The absence of chaos becomes noticeable. There was no chase, no dramatic confrontation, no final struggle that changed the outcome. There was only intrusion, restraint, and decision. That is what unsettles people, not the violence itself, but how quietly it arrived. The Clutter family did nothing unusual. They followed routine. They trusted familiarity. That trust was not misplaced by any personal failing. It was simply exploited. In modern discussions of crime, the Clutter case is often referenced as an example of how narratives can distort reality. The killers were not masterminds. They were not driven by complex ideology. They were driven by a mistake, a rumor, a belief never questioned. The legal system responded as it was designed to respond at the time. Responsibility was assigned. Punishment was delivered. Understanding lagged behind. Even now, decades later, the case resists closure in the emotional sense. It ends cleanly on paper. It does not end cleanly in memory. For Holcomb, the fields remain. The town continues. But the certainty that once defined daily life was altered permanently. People learned that violence did not need an invitation. It only needed opportunity. If you've listened through this case, you've followed it from ordinary routine to irreversible consequence, from rumor to decision, from silence to record. There is nothing left unresolved in the legal sense. But there is still something unsettled in how the crime sits in the mind. That is often the case with stories that refuse to explain themselves. They do not ask for reaction. They simply remain. As the years moved on, the Clutter case settled into a different kind of permanence. It was no longer an active investigation. It was no longer a trial unfolding in real time. It became part of the historical record. But history does not fade evenly. The memory of the murders never completely disappeared. It changed shape. For those who had lived there in 1959, the details remained sharp. They remembered the weather. They remembered where they were standing when the news reached them. They remembered the sudden presence of strangers in town, the questions, the unease. For those who came later, the case existed more quietly. It was something learned indirectly, a story told carefully, without embellishment. The Clutter family themselves became symbols of something larger. They were not remembered because of scandal or controversy. They were remembered because their lives had been ordinary. Herb Clutter's reputation endured as it had been in life. He was remembered as methodical, fair, and committed to progress. Bonnie Clutter was remembered more gently over time. As conversations about mental health evolved, her struggles were viewed with greater understanding. Nancy and Kenyon remained frozen at the ages they had been. Teenagers with unfinished lives, plans that never moved forward. The randomness of the crime continued to trouble people who studied it. There was no escalation that made sense, no pressure point that forced a decision. The violence did not erupt from chaos. It arrived through calculation, however flawed that calculation may have been. This detail is what separates the Clutter case from many others. There was no emotional storm, no personal conflict. There was a belief that something existed when it did not. That belief carried consequences that could not be reversed. Over time, the case influenced how crimes were discussed and documented. It marked a shift in how long-form crime narratives were approached. The focus moved away from spectacle and toward process, toward environment, toward decision-making, toward the ordinary circumstances that surround extraordinary harm. The Clutter murders also altered how people thought about safety. Not in a dramatic way. There was no call for panic. Instead, there was a quiet recalibration. People became aware that isolation did not guarantee protection, that familiarity did not equal security. This awareness did not vanish when the case was solved. It became part of collective memory. For Perry Smith and Richard Hickok, history closed more definitively. Their names became fixed to the crime. Their lives ended as the law required at the time. Debate about punishment continued long after their deaths. Some argued that the sentence had been necessary. Others questioned whether it had achieved anything beyond finality. Those debates never altered the facts. 4 people had been killed. 2 people had committed the crime. The state had responded. What remained unresolved was not legal, but human. How to understand a crime without motive. How to process violence that offers no explanation. As decades passed, the Clutter case continued to surface in discussions of crime, not because it was unsolved, but because it resisted interpretation. There was nothing to decode, no hidden pattern, no lesson that could be neatly summarized. It stood as a reminder that not all crimes emerge from complex forces. Some emerge from error, from assumption, from a belief never tested against reality. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, its weight comes from restraint. There is no sudden revelation at the end, no moment that reframes everything. The ending was already present at the beginning. 2 men believed something that was not true. A family lived an ordinary evening. The collision of those realities produced consequences that outlived everyone involved. That is why the case continues to be remembered. Not because it asks to be solved again, but because it asks to be understood, and then accepts that understanding may never arrive. The Clutter family did not leave behind unanswered questions about their lives. They left behind a question about randomness, about how decisions made far away by people with no connection to a place can reshape it permanently. Holcomb returned to routine. Fields were planted, harvests came and went, children grew up. But the belief that routine itself was protection did not return. It had been replaced by awareness, quiet, permanent awareness. If you've listened through this case, you've moved through it the same way the town did. Slowly, without warning, without a clear lesson at the end. That is intentional. Some stories are not meant to conclude with certainty. They are meant to be held, not resolved. If a moment from this case stayed with you, or if the simplicity of its cause unsettled you, you're not alone. That reaction is part of why the story endures. About how decisions made far away by people with no connection to a place can reshape it permanently. Holcomb returned to routine. Fields were planted, harvests came and went, children grew up. But the belief that routine itself was protection did not return. It had been replaced by awareness. Quiet, permanent awareness. If you've listened through this case, you've moved through it the same way the town did. Slowly, without warning, without a clear lesson at the end. That is intentional. Some stories are not meant to conclude with certainty. They are meant to be held, not resolved. If a moment from this case stayed with you, or if the simplicity of its cause unsettled you, you're not alone. That reaction is part of why the story endures. If this calm, late-night approach to documented crime is something you return to, more cases will follow. They will not rush. They will not sensationalize. They will sit where they belong as the night continues. Thank you for listening.